I'm obviously offended by many of these things, as are others, but let me just say I have my plate full dealing with television violence, and I think I better stick to that.
You mentioned earlier that you expect the industry to impose curbs on violence in the next year or two, and then probably they'll inch their way back up again. Did I characterize correctly?
Well, that's my fear.
Now, your fear, let's say you carry that down the line again. If your angle is to continually combat it with voluntary curbs, is there a line in the sand that Hollywood will pass and you say, all right, we've tried everything we can, we're going to come through with some tough legislation? What would it look like?
I think there is a line in the sand. And I think the line in the sand is, will we have a monitoring group? And if there is not a monitoring group, whether Paul Simon wants it or not, we're going to have legislative reaction. There is the possibility that I have thought about, if the industry doesn't come up with a monitoring group, maybe we could have a foundation or some foundations going together to do this. But that is, you know, when you get foundation support, you may get it for 3 years or something like that. And I frankly don't want to be in the fundraising business and going around knocking on doors for this kind of thing. If there is not a response, a positive response by the industry to the idea of monitoring, we're headed for some type of legislative response. What that will be, I don't know.
Is there any data that you're familiar with that show a real per capita increase in violence in America since 1970? Can you cite any of that data off the top of your head?
Well, I can't cite specific data in terms of the increase in violence. There is the one study published by the American Medical Association Journal that did a study of isolated villages in the United States, Canada, and South Africa, and found a fairly consistent pattern that when television was introduced, 15 years later, there was and the figures varied, but there was an increase of about 50% in murders, rapes, and assaults. Now, I am hesitant to lean on one statistic, but there are a whole series of studies, and they all show the same thing. And you may find a flaw in this study or a flaw in that survey, but you just can't deny the whole bulk of the research that is out there. And there is no serious scholar who questions the research and the direction of this. The one bit of research by a professor now at the University of Michigan has been following for a number of years people starting at the age of 8 and in determining what is the crime pattern and so forth. And he found in his research for people who have now reached the age of 30 that the pattern for those who have been involved in criminal activities, more important than race, more important than family, whether the family was a cohesive family or not, more important than the level of income, was how much television was watched at the age of 8.
You're an author of 12 books, I believe, and a weekly newspaper column that goes out to a number of subscribers. The questioner asked along that line, doesn't television, not just TV violence, but just television, have a harmful effect that it makes us a less literate society?
And I speak with a conflict of interest here, obviously. I think we watch too much television. I think we ought to read more books. I think we ought to try to get a little greater depth in what we do in our society, seeing Pat over here, I think we ought to go to more symphony concerts. We ought to be doing others. At the same time, I think we have to recognize that television has enriched our society in many ways, and that C-SPAN, we're on C-SPAN right now, has brought us the House and the Senate and our committees in action. I think that has been an important contribution. And I can think of any number of ways in which television has made a very solid contribution. So I am not here with an attack on television. Do we watch more than we should per week, the average American? I think yes, we do. I think we'd be better off doing a little more reading, doing some other things to enrich ourselves a little more.
We might leave the subject of television for a little bit if you wouldn't mind answering some questions unrelated to it. What is your position on the North American Free Trade Agreement, and do you get phone calls from Ross Perot on it?
I have not received a phone call from Ross Perot on that. I have not made a public declaration yet on my decision in this area. I am still doing some research. It is a complicated area. I do think that among the factors that we have to weigh are our future relationships with Mexico. I also believe the short-term result is fairly clear. Mexico is one of the few countries where we have a favorable trade surplus. The United States selling to Mexico more than Mexico sells to us. And when you reduce tariff barriers that average 15% in Mexico and 4% in the United States, as you eliminate those, the beneficiary clearly will be United States industry, so that there will be a job plus here in the United States. What is a little less clear is the long-term impact. And one of the things I'm doing is looking at research on what happened to the European community when Spain, Portugal, and Greece were at it. You have a richer central body where three poorer countries were attached. It is not completely analogous, but is somewhat analogous to the situation that we're going through.
Questioner, I'd like to get your opinion and outlook on healthcare legislation next year. How important is the healthcare legislation coming up to the Clinton administration? Will his presidency founder, if a credible healthcare bill is not on the books, will he be a one-term president without a big healthcare bill?
And all of that in 30 seconds. The answer is I don't think we ought to be looking at this in terms of what's going to happen to a Clinton re-election or Paul Simon re-election or anyone else's re-election or election. I think we ought to look and say what is, and ask what is the national need. And clearly there is a national need in this area. And I think we will get legislation. I serve on one of the two Senate committees of jurisdiction. Our committee will try to report out, I believe, by the end of the year, legislation. That means it would go to the Senate if the other committee reports at roughly the same time. That means after the first of the year, it will be on the floor of the Senate. I think it is possible that by April 1st, we could have health care legislation. The President will be spelling out the details more next week, but it will include universal coverage. It will include some cost control. It will include cards for each of us so that when we go into a hospital or go to a physician's office, we can use that without filling out all kinds of papers. It will be, there will be requirements on insurance companies to simplify and make clear what they're selling to us. And there will be a requirement for uniform forms by the insurance companies. But there are a great many things that are unanswered. But I think it is clear this nation can't continue to let 37 million people go without health insurance and to have a great many other Americans underinsured.
In the beginning of your speech, you mentioned the Middle East peace agreement as a momentous beginning for the new Jewish New Year. Yasser Arafat was on the Hill earlier this week in private meetings with Senator Mitchell and Dole and with House members. While they didn't go into too many details about what they spoke about, it's almost certain that he was asking for some type of assistance, whether it be reviewing the laws to see how economic assistance can be provided, whether it's loan guarantees. With the foreign aid bill coming through Congress, foreign aid appropriations bill, do you see any reason to believe that money might be shifted from Egypt or Israel to assist Palestine?
I don't think money is going to be shifted from Israel or Egypt, but I think we have a responsibility to assist in the problems that the Palestinians will face. I have been a strong backer of Israel. I make no apologies for that. I think it has been in our national interest as well as a historic responsibility that we have to a people who have been persecuted over the centuries. But what we have to do is, in our national interest, for a great variety of reasons, including the basic issue of oil, we have to see that there is stability in the Middle East. And I think that that means we have to see that this agreement works. And that means helping the Palestinians as they face problems in the Gaza Strip, in Jericho, and in other areas. Yes, I think we have a responsibility here, and we should live up to it.
On another matter of foreign affairs, on Monday, President Clinton further eased the trade embargo on Vietnam to allow U.S. companies to partake in multi-million-dollar contracting that will be financed by the World Bank. Many Democrats and Republicans feel that the embargo should be lifted, and some say it will be lifted by the end of the year. Do you believe that lifting the embargo and normalizing relations with Vietnam will be an insult to families of the missing that have not been accounted for?
Pat Hayes and I are the only ones here old enough to remember after World War II when Harry Truman said, we're going to help Germany, we're going to help Japan. And I remember how controversial that was, but it was the right thing to do. We haven't faced up to our responsibilities as far as Vietnam is concerned. That war is over. And in my state of Illinois, Caterpillar wants to sell to Vietnam. Japan is in there selling, Taiwan is selling, France is selling, the British are selling. Why can't we do this? Foreign policy should cater to the national interest, not to the national passion. What we're doing in Vietnam is catering to the national passion. There are some times when you just have to stand up and do some things that are not popular. This is one where clearly we ought to get this war behind us. We ought to be there doing what we can to sell and to stand up for human rights in Vietnam. The record of that government is not a good record. But to continue to isolate ourselves from Vietnam is not in the interest of the people of Vietnam, and it is not in the interest of the people of the United States.
We have two more quick questions. The first one, this could be a one-word answer, I'm not sure. Do you plan another run at the presidency?
No.
And before asking our last question, I would like to present to you a certificate of appreciation from the National Press Club. It's signed by the president of the club, Clayton Boyce, and given with great honor to you. Thank you.
I thank you very much.
We also have a very expensive coffee mug, which I believe is under $20 value, so you can take it, I believe, right? So that's yours, right?
I thank you very, very much.
Last question is, a lot of Shakespearean plays have violent scenes in them. Macbeth, for instance, ends with a great beheading. Henry V is terribly violent. If Shakespeare were alive today, do you think he would be fond of you and what you're doing?
Well, I can't really speak for Shakespeare, believe it or not. But if I may, in a somewhat more serious vein, say British television, the land from which he hailed, says that a death should not be on television screen unless it is absolutely essential to the plot. It is the British television is like the old Greek tragedies, where the murders appeared off stage, and in British television they appear off screen. I think we can learn from the land of Shakespeare. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for attending today. That's what you call much ado about TV. If you would like to get a audio or videotape, call 1-800-952-TAPE. Otherwise, have a good day. Goodbye.